Long before his beard went gray, before his hands learned to roll tobacco slow and steady by a dozen different fires, a boy named Iker Echeverria learned the one skill the frontier charged interest on: how to stay quiet when the dark decided to look back. He was 15, maybe 16. Out on those Wyoming flats, time didn't behave the way it did in towns. Days stretched, names shrank. The foreman who'd hired him off the San Francisco docks called him Basco because it was easier than asking questions. The other herders called him Kid. Nobody asked what language he dreamed in or what he left behind across the ocean. Out here, a man could arrive as a rumor and live as a pair of hands. That evening, Iker had been walking half the day along a dry creek bed, following directions that were already starting to feel like a joke. He was supposed to find a sheep camp, canvas low to the ground, a wagon, a little smoke, somebody cussing about coffee. Instead, the land grew quieter the farther he went, as if the prairie itself had decided to hold its breath. Then the smell found him. Wool, thick and sour in the air. Blood, old enough to be sticky. And smoke that had already cooled. The kind that doesn't warm you, just warns you. He crested a small rise and saw the camp sitting in a shallow bowl of land, tucked from the wind like somebody planned to live there a long time. But it didn't look lived in anymore. It looked used up. A wooden wagon lay on its side, one wheel still turning lazy, like it hadn't gotten word that the world had ended. Tin cups were scattered across trampled grass. A Dutch oven sat cracked open in the dirt like a mouth that couldn't close. And the sheep. God. They were everywhere. White coats turned gray where ash and dust clung to them, and darker where throats had been opened. Some lay piled near the fire ring like sacks someone forgot to load. For a second, Iker tried to make it make sense. Wolves, maybe. Wolves were honest about hunger, and they left tracks you could argue with. But wolves didn't usually tip wagons. Wolves didn't burn camps. He stepped down into the bowl and his boots sank into damp soil. The quiet felt wrong, not peaceful. The kind of wrong that makes your skin tighten. He started to back away, because that's what a smart boy does when the land tells him to leave. When he noticed the ground. Boot prints. A lot of them. Spur marks pressed deep and clean, circling the camp like men had walked slow on purpose. Cigarette ends ground into the mud. And on a broken mesquite branch, a strip of white cloth tied and fluttering. A flag, maybe. Or a warning. He stood there, heart hammering, and the horizon darkened like a bruise spreading under skin. The last light slipped off the hills, and the bowl began to fill with shadow. He should have turned around. He should have walked until his legs gave out, and hoped to find another camp that still believed in morning. That's when he heard it. A bell. Not a church bell. There wasn't a church for miles. Not a cowbell, too slow, too deliberate. It rang once, then again, then a pause like a man thinking, and then one more. Iker turned in a full circle, searching the sage and the ridges, trying to find something that didn't want to be found. And then he saw the rider. Up on the far lip of the bowl, a man sat on a horse, still as a cutout against the last smear of daylight. The horse's head hung low, ears flicking, patient and tired. The rider wore a coat the color of old smoke and a hat pulled down like he didn't care to show his face to the world. He didn't look like a sheriff, didn't look like a preacher or a gambler. He looked like a working man who'd seen enough trouble to stop being impressed by it. The rider watched the dead camp the way a carpenter watches a collapsed roof, measuring what failed, what was done on purpose, what couldn't be fixed. Then his gaze slid to Iker. It wasn't dramatic, no music, no thunder right then, just the sudden pressure of being seen by someone whose attention felt heavy. The rider lifted one hand, palm out, calm. Not a wave, a signal. Stay. And Iker stayed, not because he was brave, because his body obeyed before his pride could argue. The rider eased his horse down into the bowl at a walk, no hurry, no show. When he got closer, Iker saw the man's face, sun-browned, lined, mustache-trimmed plain. His eyes were pale, a washed-out blue like creek water over stone. He spoke soft. "You alone, son?" Iker tried to answer and found his English tangled up in panic. What came out was half Spanish, half something older, and all fear. The rider listened anyway, like he understood hunger in any language. He nodded once, as if the details didn't matter. From the shadows behind him came another rider, quiet as a second thought. This one sat looser in the saddle, shoulders wide, hair longer. There was a scar along his jaw, the kind you get from a bad decision that stuck around to remind you. He looked at the camp, then at the boy, then back at the camp, and his eyes didn't soften. The first rider spoke, not turning. "Charlie." The second rider answered like the name cost nothing. "Boss." So that was what they called each other. Not sir, not mister, just Boss and Charlie, two men shaped by the same kind of weather. Boss didn't take his eyes off the wreckage.
"This isn't wolves," he said. "This is men." Charlie's gaze lifted to the ridges. "And if men did it," he said, "they might be waiting to see who comes to count the bodies." The bell rang again, farther now, or maybe just carried differently by the wind. Boss didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly, listening the way you listen for a snake in tall grass. Then he spoke, almost like he didn't want the night to overhear. "That bell's not for sheep." Eager swallowed hard. "What is it for?" Boss stared toward the blackening ridge. "For riders," he said, "and for fear." Lightning stitched across the clouds then, sharp and sudden, lighting the bull like a photographer's flash. In that hard white instant, Eager saw something he hadn't noticed before, something his mind had refused to accept. A figure tied to the far side of the overturned wagon. A man, or what was left of him. Boots still on, head bent at an angle no head should bend. When darkness returned, the image stayed burned in Eager's eyes. Charlie swung down from his saddle and moved closer, careful as if the dead could still be offended. He leaned in. Pinned to the man's chest with a knife was a strip of paper, already damp with mist. Charlie read it. His mouth tightened. Boss waited, patient and still. Charlie looked back. It says, "No sheep on Creed land." Boss didn't ask who Creed was. He already knew. You could see it in the way his face went quiet, like a door shutting. The bell rang once more beyond the ridge, slow and confident, like somebody counting down. And in that moment, Eager understood something that didn't need translating. The dead camp wasn't the end of anything. It was an invitation. Boss stood there in the cold air, pale eyes fixed on the darkness. Charlie's scar looked darker under the clouded sky. Neither man raised his voice. Neither man rushed. That was what made it worse. Because fear expects noise. Fear expects bleeding or shouting or mistakes. These two men offered it none of that. They simply listened to the bell on the wind, to the prairie settling into night, and to whatever was waiting out past that ridge. Something wearing a man's name like a brand. And the boy, standing among the ash and wool in silence, realized he'd walked into a story that was already moving, already turning its gears. The kind of story that doesn't ask if you're ready. It just starts ringing.
They didn't stay in that dead camp long. Night out on the Wyoming flats wasn't a blanket you could pull up to your chin. It was a mouth, and once it opened, it didn't stop at one bite. Boss and Charlie moved the way men move when they've slept too many nights with their boots on. Boss checked the ground, checked the wind, checked the ridges where a rifle could be resting like a thought. Charlie didn't say much. He just kept turning his head, watching their back trail as if the darkness might grow hands. Charlie gathered what was worth saving: blankets, a small sack of flour that hadn't soaked through, a tin of toffee. When he looked at the dead man tied to the overturned wagon, he paused. "You want me to cut him down?" he asked quietly. Boss didn't even glance over. "Not in the dark," he said. So they left the body there, beneath the first stars, and that alone told the boy how dangerous this country was. Not because men died everywhere, but because even the living didn't have the time to mourn them safely. They rode south, away from the stench of burnt wool and blood, away from the bell that had been ringing where no bell should ring. Boss led at a walk, steady and measured. Charlie followed, never letting the same patch of darkness sit behind them for long. The boy, white, teenage, thin as worry, rode between them on a bony horse that felt like it was held together by stubbornness. Boss spoke once, low and plain. "You got family, son?" The boy tried to answer, but his words came out tangled, half of one language, half of another, and most of it fear. It wasn't a clean story. A father lost to water, a mother lost to distance, a life that had been folded up and carried across the ocean like an old shirt. Boss listened anyway, then nodded as if he'd heard it all before in different voices. "Then you ride with us a while," Boss said, "till you find what you're looking for." Charlie let out a short sound that might have been a laugh. "That's generous talk from a man who doesn't even share his last biscuit." Boss didn't rise to it. "I share what matters," he said. They rode another hour through cold, empty country. The moon climbed. The prairie flattened into a wide, dark sea of sage. And finally, tucked low in a shallow valley, they found their own camp. Canvas pitched down tight, wagon upright, the flock lying in pale heaps across the grass, like stones in a dry riverbed. To the boy, it almost looked peaceful. And that's how the West liked to trick you. It offered peace that only lasted until you believed in it. A tall, thin man stepped out of the shadows with a rifle held loose. His face was narrow, his eyes tired, and he moved like somebody who'd been listening too hard for too long. When he recognized Boss and Charlie, the rifle lowered an inch. "You were gone," the man said. "I thought—" Boss cut him off. "Get the dog. Move the flock closer. No fire tonight." The thin man's eyes slid to the boy. "And this one?"
Charlie answered before Boss could. "A stray," he said, "like us." Boss dismounted without drama. He walked straight to the center of camp, near where the wagon tongue pointed like an arrow, and crouched. He set 2 fingers on the dirt, then rose again like a man reading a page nobody else could see. "They've been here," Boss said. Charlie's eyes sharpened. "How recent?" "Since sunset," Boss replied. The thin man, Harlan, though nobody seemed eager to use his name, swallowed hard. Charlie said the word that settled over the camp like a second sky. "Creed." Boss didn't repeat it. He didn't have to. The boy felt that name settle into his stomach anyway, heavy and cold. Boss gave orders like he was moving cattle through a gate. "Charlie, take the left ridge. I'll take the right. If you hear a bell, don't go toward it. You go around." The boy blinked. "A bell?" Charlie glanced down at him. "You ever hear a bell where it shouldn't be, kid?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. Charlie's expression didn't soften. "Then you know it's never for anything good." They took their positions. The camp became a held breath. Sheep shifted and sighed. Wind slid through sagebrush. Somewhere, a coyote yipped, and then stopped, like it had been warned. The boy sat under the wagon, knees pulled close, trying to make himself smaller than his fear. Boss was a silhouette on one ridge. Charlie was a silhouette on the other. Both men looked like pieces of the land until you remembered the land didn't carry guns. Then the sound came again. 1 ring, 2, a pause, and 1 more. The bell. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat on the air like a hook. Charlie's voice drifted from his ridge, barely louder than wind. "Boss." Boss answered calmly. "I hear him." 3 shapes emerged at the edge of the flock. Riders, faces covered with burlap sacks tied at the neck. They looked like scarecrows that had learned to ride. One of them held the bell, small, iron, chipped, dangling like a joke that didn't want to be funny. The sheep stirred and pressed closer together. Animals always knew when men arrived with bad intentions. Boss stepped forward into the moonlight, just enough to show himself. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't shout. He simply stood where they could see him, and the riders stopped as if they'd run into an invisible fence. Boss spoke low but carrying. "Put that down." The burlap man rang the bell once, sharp and insolent. From the ridge, Charlie's rifle clicked. Not a shot, just the sound of it, clean and final, like a door being locked. The bellman froze. Boss didn't change his posture. "Ring it again," he said, "and you'll drop it. Might drop it with your hand still attached, might not." One of the sack-faced riders laughed, a short bark meant to sound brave. "Your own Creed land," he called. Boss didn't argue about fences or maps. He tilted his head slightly, as if measuring the voice. "Tell Creed," he said, "that sheep don't eat desolate, men do." Charlie's voice floated down from the ridge, mild as a man asking for salt. "Go on, ride back to your boss. Tell him you saw 2 men in a flock. Tell him you didn't like the look of it." For a moment, the boy expected violence anyway. The night felt like it wanted it. The sheep felt it too, tight bodies, twitching ears. Wind tugged at the burlap sacks, making them ripple like dead skin. But the bellman lowered his arm. The 3 riders turned their horses and slipped back into the dark. No whooping, no final insult, just retreat, quiet as a thread kept in a pocket. When they were gone, the camp didn't relax right away. Silence took its time returning, and even then it didn't feel friendly. Charlie came down from the ridge and walked in, rifle lowered, eyes still scanning as if the riders might circle back on a different wind. Boss stayed where he was, watching the darkness beyond the sheep. The boy found his voice again, thin and shaky. "Why didn't you shoot them?" Charlie looked at him for a long second, then spoke like he was answering something older than the question. "Because we're not trying to start a war," he said. "We're trying to see who already did." Boss finally turned toward the boy. His face was calm, but the calm felt heavier now, like a weight being held on purpose. "They wanted you scared," Boss said. "Fear makes men stupid. Stupid makes men easy." The boy swallowed. "And if we don't get scared?" Boss looked out at the flock, pale in moonlight, defenseless in a country that loved taking things. "They'll try something else," Boss said. No one argued. No one tried to laugh it off. Harlan tightened his grip on his rifle. Charlie checked the darkness the way a man checks a door lock. The boy sat back under the wagon and tried to breathe quietly enough not to attract attention from the night itself. Far off, beyond the ridges, the bell rang again. Distant now, fading, like a promise that wasn't done speaking.
By morning, the sky had gone clear and hard, the kind of blue that made the night's terror feel like something a man might have imagined. Wyoming did that. It let the sun clean the blood off the land and pretend nothing had happened. But the sheep didn't forget. They moved tight, nervous, always listening. And Boss, quiet Boss with the washed-out eyes, made a decision that wasn't about comfort. It was about not getting cornered again. They needed salt, flour, lamp oil, cartridges. They needed to see what kind of town sat nearby and what kind of man thought he could own the air between hills. They needed answers, even if answers weren't sold in sacks. So Boss led them toward the nearest place with a name, Dry Fork. Dry Fork looked like it had been built by men in a hurry and maintained by men who'd stopped caring. False front buildings leaned into the wind like tired shoulders. The street was a long stripe of mud packed with wagon ruts and hoof prints. A hitching rail ran along the main drag, warped and polished by years of nervous hands and restless horses. There was a church, too, unfinished boards that still looked pale, like raw wood not yet hardened by time. Beside it sat a schoolhouse with square windows that stared out at the street as if they'd seen too much for something that was supposed to teach children. And near the center of town, taller than it had any right to be, stood a bell tower. Not grand, not fancy, just wooden beams and iron hardware built for function. The bell inside hung dark and heavy, like it was waiting to be useful again. The boy, Basque, white, still carrying the ocean in his accent, noticed it right away. His stomach tightened as if the bell could smell fear. "That bell," he murmured, almost to himself. Charlie answered without looking away from the street. "Town bell," he said. "Fire, meetings, funerals." Boss's eyes stayed on it longer than they needed to. "Or something else," he said, soft as dust. They dismounted at the general store. The place smelled like kerosene and rope and old coffee. Inside, the shelves were stacked with flour sacks, canned goods, coils of twine, tobacco tins, and glass jars that caught the light and made everything feel a little too exposed. Men inside looked up when Boss and Charlie entered. Some stared too long. Some turned away too fast. A few did that thing people do when they're trying to act casual while measuring how far they are from a door. The storekeeper, a narrow man with a red nose and a tight mouth, greeted them like he'd never met them but had heard plenty. "You're the sheepmen," he said. Boss didn't correct him. He didn't introduce himself either. "We're passing through." The storekeeper's eyes flicked to Charlie's scar, then to Boss's hands, then to the boy. "Passing through is what everyone says," he murmured. "Creed don't like sheep." Charlie leaned on the counter, relaxed in a way that didn't mean safe. "Seems like Creed doesn't like breathing either, but the rest of us manage it." A couple men gave quick, nervous chuckles, like laughter could be used as a shield. The storekeeper didn't join in. "If you want salt and flour," he said quietly, "buy it now. If you want to stay alive, don't stay after sundown." Boss began supplies without any fuss. He moved like a man who didn't care who was watching, because watching never changed a thing. He chose flour, salt, lamp oil, cartridges. The boy stood close, trying to look smaller than his own shadow. While Boss handled the purchases, Charlie drifted toward the front window. He didn't press his face to the glass. He just stood there, angled slightly, and looked out as if he already knew what he'd see. Across the street stood a 2-story building with a porch, cleaner than the rest, sharper edges, better paint. It carried itself like it wasn't part of Dry Fork, like it belonged to some richer place that had sent it here to supervise. A man leaned on that porch rail. White shirt, black vest, sleeves rolled neat, hat clean. His posture was the kind you only get when you believe the ground will hold you because it's been paid to. Charlie stared at him through the glass. The man stared right back, and then he smiled slowly, as if he enjoyed being recognized. Charlie's voice came out almost cheerful. "Well," he said, "there's the man who owns the air." Boss stepped up beside him and saw the porch figure. For a beat, the store held colder, like wind had found a crack in the walls. Creed crossed the street with easy confidence. 2 broad-shouldered men followed a few steps behind. Their hands never wandered far from their belts. People on the porches and in the doorways avoided looking straight at him. It wasn't respect. It was survival. Creed entered the store like it was another room in his house. He removed his gloves slowly, finger by finger, as if violence required cleanliness. His smile was polite, and somehow that made it worse. "Mr. Spearman," Creed said. Boss didn't react to the name, but he didn't deny it either. "Mr. Creed." Creed's eyes slid to Charlie. "Mr. Waite," he added, with the faint satisfaction of a man who likes knowing things about other men. Charlie tipped his hat the smallest amount. "Creed." Creed's gaze drifted to the boy for half a breath. Not curiosity, inventory. Then he looked back at Boss. "You've brought sheep into cattle country," Creed said. It wasn't a question. Boss's voice stayed even. "We're on public range." Creed smiled like he'd heard a child recite something cute. "Public range," he repeated. "Yes, that old hymn." Charlie's voice cut in, mild but sharp. "You come to sing with us, Creed? Or you just like hearing yourself talk?" Creed didn't rise to the insult. He never had to. The 2 men behind him shifted their weight in unison, like a pack tightening its circle. Creed turned slightly, addressing the room as if he was doing everyone a favor. "Dry Fork has rules," he said. "No sheep within a good stretch of the river. No sheep on the North Ridge. No sheep on winter grass." Boss didn't blink. "That's a lot of rules." "Rules are how civilization happens," Creed said smoothly. Charlie snorted. "Civilization always seems to arrive with men who can't build a fence but can build a coffin." The storekeeper looked like he might faint. A murmur moved through the men nearby, part agreement, part fear of agreeing. Creed stepped closer to Boss, dropping his voice as if sharing advice. "You should turn south," he said. "Take the railroad. Sell elsewhere. Wyoming is for cattle." Boss met his eyes full on.
"This land was here before you," Boss said. "It'll be here after." Creed's smile didn't leave, but it sharpened at the edges. "After," he said, "is a long time to plan for." Boss didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply spoke the truth that had drawn him into town in the first place. "Unpleasantness already happened," Boss said. "A herder's camp burned. Sheep cut. A man tied to a wagon with your name pinned to him." Creed's eyebrows rose a fraction. "A shame," he said. "Dangerous country." Charlie's voice turned quiet, the way a blade turns quiet when it's close. For a moment nobody moved. Even the dust in the sunbeams felt suspended. Then Creed turned as if he had finished. He slipped his gloves back on with the same careful calm. And outside, right on cue, the town bell clanged once. Hard, sudden, like a slap. The boy flinched so sharply his shoulders rose toward his ears. The bell's sound went through him like cold water. Boss didn't flinch. Charlie didn't either. Creed paused on the porch outside the store and looked back over his shoulder, as if the bell had spoken for him. Then he walked away, boots still strangely clean in Dry Fork's mud. Boss finished paying. No hurry, no drama. He tied the supplies down on the pack horse with careful hands, cinching straps like he was sealing a promise. Outside, the town watched them the way a storm watches, hoping it'll pass, knowing it might not. The boy glanced up at Boss, trying to shape a question that felt too big. Boss didn't offer reassurance. He just looked once more toward that bell tower, iron mouth open against the sky, then swung up into the saddle. Charlie rode beside him as they left town, his eyes still scanning porches and windows in the quiet spaces between buildings where men like to hide. As Dry Fork shrank behind them, Boss spoke softly, more to the land than to anyone else. "That bell's going to ring again." And the boy believed him, not because he understood town politics or range law, but because he'd heard the bell out on empty prairie where it had no business being. A bell like that didn't belong to a town. It belonged to trouble.
By late afternoon, the prairie had that uneasy stillness that comes right before something bad decides to happen. The sun was dropping, the wind was picking up, and the sheep, usually dull as fence posts, kept bunching tighter than they needed to, as if they'd heard news the men hadn't. Boss didn't pretend it was nothing. He walked the outer edge of the flock with his rifle hanging easy, scanning the ridgelines, the way a man scans a room where he knows there's a knife. Charlie stayed near the wagon, quiet, checking cartridges with the bored patience of someone who'd been forced to learn that boredom could turn into blood in a heartbeat. Harlan hovered near the canvas, tense and thin, like fear had been whittling him down for years. And Iker, young, white, and still new to this kind of country, kept his back close to the wagon wheel, trying to make his breathing small. No fire, no warm light, just the last red smear of day bleeding out behind the hills. Boss gave the order earlier, steady as always. Move the flock at dusk, keep them tight, and if the bell rang again, don't answer it. Iker didn't ask what that meant. He'd heard that bell in the wrong place already. He knew enough to understand that some sounds weren't meant to guide you, some were meant to herd you. When darkness finally slid in, it came fast. The sky turned to iron. The wind carried the smell of sage and something sharper, something like old smoke, even though nothing in their camp was burning. The sheep shifted, pressed closer, ears flicking, soft bleat swallowed quickly, like the animals didn't want to be heard either. Then the bell rang. Not loud, not close enough to see, but close enough to make Iker's stomach knot. One, then two. A pause, then one more. The same measured pattern, like somebody counting. Boss stopped walking. He didn't freeze. He simply went still, the way a man does when he's decided listening is more important than moving. Charlie lifted his head without looking back. "They're circling," he said. Out on the ridgeline, shapes moved, dark lumps against darker sky. Riders, more than before. A voice drifted down, thin and ugly. "Shape men." Another voice laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that didn't carry joy, only permission. "Come see what wool looks like when it burns." Iker's throat went dry. He wanted to crawl under the wagon and disappear into the dirt. Boss stepped forward into the open, letting the darkness see him. He didn't shout back. He didn't posture. He just made sure they knew exactly where he stood. And then the night answered with glass. A bottle arced through the air from the ridge, spinning end over end. In the dim light it looked almost slow, almost harmless, until it hit the ground. Boss snapped one word, sharp enough to cut. "Down!" The bottle shattered near the flock. Flame erupted, sudden and hungry. Oil spread across dry grass in a slick sheet, and fire ran along it like it had been waiting. The sheep panicked instantly. They surged and pressed and broke into desperate bleating, the sound rising like a wave. Another bottle flew, then another. 3 fires bloomed around them, bright orange wounds in the dark. Smoke rode low, stinging eyes, turning breath into something you could taste. Harlan fired a warning shot into the air, trying to turn the sheep back toward the wagon. It didn't help. The gun crack only added to the chaos. Sheep slammed into each other, stumbled, tried to climb over bodies that weren't meant to be climbed. Charlie moved first. He ran to the wagon, yanked a canvas tarp loose, and threw it over a flame patch.
The fabric billowed once, then dropped and smothered the fire with a hiss of trapped heat. Boss stomped at another line of flame, boots crushing burning grass into dirt. Sparks jumped and died under his heel. But the men on the ridge weren't there to light campfires. They were there to break something. Gunfire snapped from above. A sheep dropped, legs folding like it had been cut at the joints. Then another shot, another sheep. The ridge whooped and laughed like it was entertainment. Charlie fired back, measured, controlled, not spraying, not guessing. One of the riders jerked and slid off his saddle out of sight. The laughter died fast after that. Then the riders charged. They came down the ridge in a scattered line, hooves tearing up dirt, guns flashing. Sheep became a white storm of bodies and terror. Smoke and dust and firelight turned the camp into a nightmare that didn't hold still long enough to understand. Iker hugged the wagon, eyes wide, heart banging so hard he thought it might give him away. Boss stepped forward into that chaos, and what unsettled Iker most was how calm he looked. Boss wasn't reckless. He wasn't desperate. He moved like a man who'd already accepted the math of violence and decided not to let it rush him. He raised his rifle and fired twice. 2 riders went down, clean, quick. Charlie worked in a different rhythm, shooting, shifting, shooting again, never standing in the same place long enough for a bullet to remember him. He used the wagon like a fort, the shadows like cover, the panic like distraction. And then Iker saw it, the moment that made time heighten. A rider broke through the edge of the flock, angling around the burning grass. He had a clear line on Boss's back. He raised his gun. Iker opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. His lungs locked up. Boss turned without looking, as if he'd felt the intention in the air. His hand dropped to his holster. 1 shot. The rider pitched forward and rolled out of his saddle. Boss hadn't aimed the way Iker thought aiming worked. There was no long sighting, no hesitation. The gun came up like it belonged there, and the shot landed like it had been promised. The charging line wavered. You could feel it, the sudden realization that this wasn't a helpless camp, and the men inside it weren't going to beg. Charlie shouted once, harsh enough to carry through the smoke. Back! Boss didn't shout. He simply stepped forward again, face hard in the firelight, and that small motion did something to the riders. It reminded them that fear was supposed to be their weapon, and it wasn't working. The riders began to pull up, then turn. A few tried to drag wounded men. The rest just fled, scrambling back toward the ridge. The bell rang again from somewhere above, frantic now, like whoever held it was trying to stitch courage back together. It didn't help. The darkness swallowed the riders as they retreated, leaving only smoke, scorched grass, dead sheep, and a silence that took its time returning. When it finally did, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the land was waiting to see what would happen next. Harlan sat down hard in the dirt, rifle across his knees, and started laughing. Thin, broken laughter that didn't belong to anything funny. It sounded like a man trying not to fall apart. Charlie walked to Boss and looked him over without touching him. "You all right?" he asked. Boss nodded once, eyes still on the ridge. "They'll come again." Charlie glanced at the burns, the carcasses, the drifting smoke. His voice turned quiet. "They didn't come for sheep." Boss didn't argue. "No," he said. "They came for us." Iger stared at Boss's revolver, the faintest curl of smoke still lifting in the cool air. He felt something inside him shift. Part fear, part awe, part anger at how small he was in a world where men decided other men's lives like it was a business. The camp smelled like burnt wool, a sharp, human smell. The sheep, what was left of them, pressed in close, trembling as if the night had climbed under their skins. Boss didn't congratulate anyone. He didn't tell them they'd done well. He just stood there, watching the ridge like it owed him something. Charlie reloaded out of habit, hands steady. He didn't look proud. He looked tired, like this was the shape his life kept taking, no matter how far he rode. Iker swallowed and found his voice again, small against all that dark. "What now?" he asked. Boss didn't look at him right away. When he did, the calm in his eyes wasn't comfort. It was clarity. "Now," Boss said softly, "we don't let them decide what we're afraid of." And the wind moved through the sage again, carrying smoke away into the black, carrying the last echoes of that bell into places it didn't belong. The night had tested them. It had learned something. And somewhere out beyond the ridge, Iger was sure of it. Men were sitting around a fireless camp, listening to the quiet they hadn't expected, and planning what they'd try next.
They rode back into Dry Fork under a pale, hard daylight that made everything look too honest. Mud still clung to the street in dark ruts, and the wooden fronts of the buildings stood there like men pretending they hadn't heard gunshots in the night. The town didn't feel alive so much as it felt awake, watching, waiting, hoping trouble would pick somebody else. Boss kept his horse at a calm walk. Charlie rode a half-step behind, eyes moving from porch to window to alley mouth, like he was reading a language written in shadows. Between them, the young herder, white, foreign, and still learning what America sounded like when it got mean, could feel the air tighten around the town, the way it tightened around a campfire when someone mentioned rope. Near the church, behind a small clapboard house, a woman stood scattering grain for chickens. She wore a plain dress with her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned tight, posture steady. Nothing about her said soft. She moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that the world didn't stop just because it hurt. She looked up as the riders passed, and she didn't flinch. Charlie tipped his hat. "Ma'am." The woman didn't bother smiling. "You're the sheep men," she said, like it was a fact and a warning in the same breath. Boss nodded once. "We were attacked." "I know," she said. She wiped her hands on her apron as if trouble left a residue. The boy's eyes drifted automatically toward the bell tower that stood near the center of town, too tall for its surroundings, iron mouth hanging open like it was waiting to speak again. "You hear everything," the woman added, catching his glance. "Sound carries in Dry Fork. Sound and trouble." Charlie shifted his weight in the saddle and studied her. "And you're—" "Delahart," she said. "I run the boarding house when I have boarders. Mostly I feed men who swear they'll pay on Friday." Charlie's mouth twitched. "So you feed honest men starving?" Della's eyes flicked past him toward Boss. "Creed's riders are getting bold," she said. "They don't usually burn sheep this close. Means he's ready to push you out hard." Boss didn't argue with her phrasing. "We found a camp burned 2 days ago," he said. "A man tied to a wagon, a note pinned to him with Creed's name on it." Della's jaw tightened for the briefest moment, like a door clicking shut. "So he's already started writing his ending," she murmured. Charlie leaned slightly forward. "Who rings that bell?" Della didn't look at the tower. She didn't have to. "Whoever Creed tells to," she said. "Sometimes it's the sheriff. Sometimes it's a boy Creed buys with candy and threats. Sometimes it's a man who wears a sack over his face so he doesn't have to admit he's somebody's neighbor." Charlie let out a quiet breath. "A town full of men hiding," he said. "A town full of men hiding behind Creed's shadow," replied Della, pretending it's a roof. Boss's gaze slid to the boy. "Wait here," he said. "Stay with the chickens." The boy stiffened. "I can help." Charlie looked him up and down with the kind of appraisal that wasn't unkind, just practical. "You can help by staying alive," he said. "If a chicken offers you a job, take it. It's safer." Boss and Charlie swung down from their horses and crossed the street toward Creed's office. The boy watched them go, feeling the space between safety and danger stretch like a rope pulled taut. A thin man stepped out near the office porch, Sheriff Rusk. He wore his star like it was borrowed from somebody braver. He saw Boss and Charlie and stopped moving, like a man hoping stillness could make him invisible. Boss spoke first, calm and level. "We're looking for the men who rode our camp." Rusk's eyes darted. "You got no proof," he said, too quick. Charlie's voice stayed mild, and that mildness made it sharper. "We got dead sheep," he said. "We got bullets. We got a bell. That's proof enough for a man who wants to see." Rusk's kicks tightened. "This is Creed's matter," he snapped, "not yours." Boss stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "It became ours when men started shooting," he said. "Leave town," Rusk said, swallowing. "Creed says you're not welcome." Charlie gave a short, humorless sound. "So Creed's the law now." Rusk glanced toward the bell tower like he was waiting for it to answer. Boss didn't take the bait. He asked the question that mattered. "Who's ringing that bell at night?" Rusk's lips parted, then closed again. "I don't—" A voice came from inside the office, smooth as oil. "Sheriff." Rusk turned toward the doorway like a dog hearing a whistle. Creed stepped on the porch in a clean white shirt and black vest, gloves on as if the world was dirty. He smiled like he'd practiced it in a mirror and liked the result. "Gentlemen," Creed said, "still breathing. That's good." Charlie didn't return the politeness. "You send riders to burn sheep camps?" Creed looked mildly offended. "I don't ride at night," he said. "I have paperwork." Boss held Creed's eyes. "Your men attacked us." Creed's smile didn't shift. "Men do foolish things," he said. "Men panic when they think their livelihood is threatened." Charlie's tone sharpened. "Your livelihood is owning other men." "My livelihood is order," Creed replied smoothly. "Sheep are disorder." Boss didn't raise his voice. "We're leaving when we're done," he said. "But we're not leaving because you told us." Creed's eyes narrowed a fraction. "That's pride," he said softly. "Pride gets men buried out here." Charlie shrugged. "Plenty of room." Creed's gaze slid past them across the street, to where the boy stood near Della and her chickens. The smile that touched Creed's mouth wasn't friendly. It was arithmetic. "Nice boy," Creed said. "Be a shame if he got lost." Boss's posture changed. It was subtle, just a shift in the shoulders, a quiet closing of something inside him. Charlie saw it too. Charlie's hand drifted closer to his holster, not drawing, just acknowledging the shape the conversation had taken. Across the street, Della's voice cut through the tension, clear as a thrown stone. "Creed," she called, "if you threaten children in daylight, at least do it loud enough for the whole town to hear." Curtains twitched. A door cracked open. The air changed, just slightly, like fear adjusting its grip. Creed turned his head toward her, smile still there, but the eyes colder. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "always outspoken. It's a trait." "It's a habit," Della answered, not moving an inch. "One I don't plan to break." Creed looked back at Boss and Charlie as if returning to business. "You should go," he said, quietly, "before somebody makes a mistake." Charlie's eyes didn't leave Creed's face. Somebody already did. Boss turned away first, not retreating, ending the conversation. Charlie followed, still watching angles, still listening to the town's silence like it might snap. They crossed back toward Della and the boy.
The mud sucked at their boots as if the earth itself wanted to keep them there. Boss stopped beside the chickens, close enough for the boy to feel the steadiness coming off him like heat from a stone. Behind them, Creed remained on the porch with Rusk, both men framed by the office like they belonged to it. The bell tower stood above everything, quiet for the moment, but not innocent. Boss tightened the slap on his pack horse, hands careful and sure. Charlie glanced toward the tower, then toward the alleys, then back at Boss, reading him. The boy swallowed. He didn't know what to call what he felt. Fear, anger, relief, all tangled together. Boss lifted his eyes once more toward that iron bell hanging in daylight. Then he lowered his gaze to the street ahead, the range beyond, the trouble waiting like weather. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer promises. He only made the smallest nod, as if to himself. And somewhere inside that town, behind wood walls and watching eyes, the West was already deciding what it would do next.
That night, Boss didn't camp near Dry Fork. He led the wagon and what was left of the flock into a shallow valley where the rocks rose up like broken teeth. The place had cover, high ground, and only a few ways in or out, exactly the kind of spot a man chose when he believed trouble would come looking. No fire, no warm glow, just a dim patch of canvas, a wagon that creaked when the wind leaned on it, and sheep huddled so tight they looked like a single pale animal breathing in pieces. Iker stayed close to the stones, watching the dark like it might blink. Harlan kept his rifle across his lap and tried not to swallow too loudly. Boss and Charlie spoke near the wagon in voices that didn't travel. Charlie was the first to say it out loud, the thing they'd both been circling all day. He kept his eyes on the ridgeline as he spoke, like the hills were listening. You saw how Creed looked at the boy. Boss didn't argue. He didn't even sigh. He'll use anything, he said. Charlie paused, then asked the kind of question men only ask when they already know the answer. How long you think before he tries to hang one of us? Boss's reply came without trauma. When it benefits him. Charlie let out a low breath that might have been amusement if it hadn't sounded so tired. That's an answer, he muttered. The camp settled into its hush. Sheep shifted, then quieted. Wind moved through the sage and caught on the rocks, making a sound like a long, dry whisper. Later, when the night got colder and the stars looked sharp enough to cut, Charlie walked over to where Iker kept watch behind a boulder. He didn't come like a friendly man. He came like a man taking a break from guarding the world. He sat down with his back against stone. For a while he said nothing at all. Then he spoke softly, as if it was safer not to let the valley hear. You ever see a man hanged, kid? Iker's throat tightened. He shook his head. No. Charlie nodded once. Lucky, he said. And then after a pause, it's quiet at the end. Not like folks think. Not like the stories. Just quiet. Iker didn't answer. There wasn't much to say to quiet. Charlie stared out into the dark and kept going, voice steady but distant. Creed likes rope, he said. He likes it because it makes the town do the killing for him. He doesn't have to dirty his hands. Just hands out the suggestion, and the crowd does the rest. Iker tried to make sense of that, and couldn't help asking the question that bothered him most. Why do people listen? Charlie's mouth tightened. Because it's easier than standing alone, he said. Most folks would rather be part of a crowd than part of a conscience. It wasn't a lecture. It was the weather report. Charlie said it the way a man says, winter's coming, and nobody argues. Silence filled the gap again. Somewhere in the camp a sheep coughed softly. The sound felt too small for a place that big. Then Charlie spoke again, quieter. You know why I don't sleep good? Iker glanced at him. Charlie still wasn't looking at the boy. His eyes stayed on the horizon, like his memories lived out there. I was a soldier, he said. Not the kind people clap for, just one. I learned how to kill men in places that didn't have sheep. Places with trees so thick sunlight couldn't get through. Men screaming in languages I didn't know. He exhaled slowly, like he was letting something out through a crack. After a while you stop hearing the language, he said. You just hear the screaming. Iker's hands clenched around his knees. He didn't know what comfort looked like for a man like Charlie, and he didn't try to invent it. Charlie's voice stayed even, but something inside it rubbed raw. When I came west, I thought the sky would fix me. Big sky, clean air, like washing. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Turns out you can wash blood off your hands. Not off your head. The wind slid through the rocks again, and the words hung there a moment longer than they should have. Charlie shifted, as if the ground had grown uncomfortable. Boss don't talk about his past, he added. But he's got one. Everybody out here does. Iker swallowed. He'd been holding one question all day, and now it slipped out before he could stop it. His boss? A gunman? Charlie's mouth twitched, just barely. Boss is a sheepman, he said.
That's what he is today. Tomorrow he might be something else. He turned his head at last and looked down at Iker, eyes tired but clear. You ever watch a rattlesnake? Charlie asked. Iker nodded. He'd seen them sunning on rocks, still as straps until they weren't. They don't move until they have to, Charlie said. Then they move faster than your fear can finish forming. He stood up, brushing dust from his coat. Get some sleep, he told the boy. If the bell rings, wake me. If it rings twice, wake boss. If it rings 3 times. Charlie paused, then shrugged like a man refusing to decorate the truth. If it rings these times, he might as well pray in whatever language you got. He walked away toward his bedroll, leaving Iker with the sheep's soft noises and the cold pressing down from above. Iker tried to sleep. He really did. But the valley felt like a trap made of quiet. He lay near the wagon wheel with his blanket pulled tight, listening to every small sound the way a starving man listens to bread being cut. The wind shifted. The sheep murmured. Somewhere in the rocks, a pebble clicked loose and rolled. Each tiny noise tried to become a bigger one in his mind. He drifted off in pieces, and his dreams took the pieces and sharpened them. He dreamed of the bell, iron and black, ringing where it shouldn't, ringing like somebody was calling him by a name he didn't want. He dreamed of riders with burlap faces drifting over ridges. He dreamed of the burned camp, the overturned wagon, the dead sheep laid out like a message. And threaded through it all was a sound that wasn't the bell at all. Rope. A faint creak, slow and rhythmic, like somebody practicing. He woke with his heart racing and his mouth dry. For a moment he didn't know where he was. Then the rock teeth in the cold sky reminded him. The camp was still there. The sheep were still there. The men were still there, scattered in their positions like pieces on a board. Harlan sat on watch, rigid, rifle held close. Boss stood higher up on a rock shelf, a silhouette against the stars, coat barely moving. Charlie lay in his bedroll with his eyes open, not sleeping, not fully awake either, just waiting in that thin place between. Iker stared into the darkness beyond the wagon. The valley didn't offer comfort. It offered edges. Every shadow had a shape. Every shape could be a man. The rope creaked again, so faint he wasn't even sure it was real. It might have been the wagon shifting in wind. It might have been his imagination insisting on making a sound out of fear. But he looked up at the wagon anyway. A length of hemp rope hung from the side, swaying gently and rubbing against rough wood. The fibers made the smallest whisper of friction, just enough to sound like memory. Iker swallowed hard, and forced his breathing to slow. Out there, in the kind of country where men used bells to hear fear, and rope to turn neighbors into executions, sleep didn't come like mercy. It came like exhaustion. It came when the body simply ran out of ways to stay tense. And in the darkness, Boss remained still on the rocks, calm as a man who refused to let night decide where he can stand. Charlie lay with his eyes open, carrying his ghosts without naming them. Harlan watched the ridgeline, trying to believe that being ready would be enough. The sheep pressed together, pale and quiet, as if they could make themselves invisible. And the valley held them all, waiting, patient as stone, for whatever sound would come next.
The next morning came in quiet pieces. The rocky valley still held the camp like a clenched fist, stone teeth, low canvas, a wagon crouched in the dirt, and sheep packed so tight they barely looked like individuals. The air smelled of wet sage and old smoke, even though nothing burned. That was when a rider showed up who didn't belong out there. A boy, maybe 12, thin as a fence rail, came in slow with a strip of white cloth tied to a stick. He held it up like it could protect him. His horse looked tired, and the boy's eyes kept skipping toward the ridges, as if he expected bullets to grow out of the rock. Boss met him halfway with the calm of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make the world listen. Charlie hovered nearby, a few steps off, watching everything the way a wolf watches a new animal step into the clearing. The boy swallowed hard. "Mrs. Hart says," he started, and his voice cracked on the name like it was too heavy. Charlie cut in, quiet and sharp. "What does she say?" The messenger fumbled a folded piece of paper from his coat and held it out with both hands. Boss took it carefully, opened it, and read without changing his face. But something did change, just a small tightening around his eyes, the kind that meant the words had teeth. Charlie leaned in to catch the meaning, his jaw set. The note was simple, urgent. Creed's men had taken 2 townsmen in the night. One of them had fought back. Now both were in the jail for their own safety, and nobody was allowed to see them. Anybody who'd lived long enough in that country knew what "for their own safety" could mean when the wrong man said it. Charlie breathed out through his nose. "A protective jail," he muttered. "That's a new kind of lie." Boss folded the paper again like it was something he might need to show later, not just read. Then he looked at the messenger boy.
"Who's in the jail?" Boss asked. The boy hesitated. "Mr. Lyle, from the livery, and Mr. Amos, the schoolteacher." He looked down at his hands. "They said they talked too loud." Charlie's gaze drifted toward the horizon where Dry Fork sat out of sight, and you could almost feel the town in the distance, wood and mud and fear arranged into streets. "Town's starting to wake up," Charlie said. Boss didn't nod. He didn't smile. He just said, "Creed will put them on a rope before the town finds its courage." There was no drama in his voice, just a statement, like predicting weather. Iker stood close enough to hear it all. He felt something hard move inside his chest, something between fear and anger. He'd come to this country thinking work was work, sheep were sheep, and now he was learning that people could be herded too. Boss turned to him. "You stay with Harlan," he said. Iker's words came out before he could stop them. "I can help." Charlie looked him over once, not cruel, just honest. "You can help by staying alive." Boss didn't argue further. He and Charlie tightened cinches, checked tack, mounted up, and rode out of the valley with the kind of quiet purpose that made the air feel thinner behind them. Iker watched them go until the rocks swallowed their silhouettes. After that, the hours dragged. Sheep grazed, but not peacefully. Wind shifted, then shifted again. The sun moved across the sky like it had all the time in the world. Then far off, the bell rang. Once. The sound didn't carry like a friendly thing. It carried like a command. Iker froze. His stomach dropped the way it had the first time he'd heard that bell in empty country. Then the bell rang again. Twice. Harlan cursed under his breath, face tightening as if he'd been struck. "That's town alarm," he said, "or fire." Iker kept staring toward Dry Fork, even though it wasn't visible from the valley. He could still picture the tower, the iron mouth hanging open, the rope waiting for a hand. A third ring followed, heavier, slower. Not fire. Not a meeting. A gathering. A crowd. Harlan crapped his rifle and stood. "We should go." Iker was already moving. The flock and wagon felt suddenly useless. If Boss and Charlie were in town, and the town had gathered, then whatever was happening wasn't going to wait politely. They mounted fast but not careless. Hooves bit into dirt. The horses' muscles worked under wet hide. Dust rose in a thin veil, then fell again as they pushed over the flats toward Dry Fork. The town came into view as a cluster of wooden shapes under a bright sky. The bell tower rose above it like a finger, and near the center a crowd had gathered, too many people packed too tight. By the time Iker and Harlan reached the edge of town, the air felt charged, as if the whole street was holding a breath it couldn't release. Boss and Charlie were already there. Boss stood in the open street with that same quiet stillness, like he decided the middle of trouble was exactly where he belonged. Charlie leaned close to the jail door, listening, his body angled like a man ready to move. Della Hart stood at the edge of the crowd, pale, steady, eyes locked forward. She looked like someone who'd already made peace with being watched. Above everything, the bell tower loomed, silent now, as if it had rung enough and was waiting to see what it had started. Then a voice rolled out from the porch of Creed's office. Creed stood there like a preacher, hands folded, face composed. "Dry Fork is under threat," he called, "from outlaws and sheep thieves." A murmur ran through the crowd, some disbelief, some relief. People liked a story that told them who to blame. It meant they didn't have to think too hard. Creed gestured toward the jail. "We have 2 men who tried to incite violence against lawful authority," he said, smooth as oil. "For the peace of this town, they will be dealt with." Sheriff Rusk stepped forward near him, looking sick and small. His star gleamed too bright for him, like it didn't belong on that chest. Boss's voice cut through the street, calm but loud enough to reach the back rows. "You don't deal with school teachers," he said. "You don't deal with stablemen." Creed's smile didn't move much. "You again," he said, like Boss was a problem he'd expected to sweep up later. Charlie called out next, sharper. "Open the jail. Let them be seen. Let them speak." Rusk swallowed. "I can't," he said weakly. Boss stepped closer to him, boots sinking into mud. "You can," Boss said. "You choose not to." The crowd shifted. People looked at each other. A town deciding whether to stand up always looks like that at first. Small movements, uncertain eyes, hands tightening on nothing. Creed lifted his voice again, soft but carrying. "Sheriff," he said, "do your duty." Rusk's hand hovered near his belt like it might obey on its own. Charlie's hand drifted too, not drawing, just acknowledging the direction the day was turning. Then Boss did something small that changed the air. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded note. He held it up like a lantern. "You want peace," he called to the crowd. "Then stop letting this man call murder order." Creed's small finally tightened, just a hairline crack in the polish. "You're stirring trouble," he said, voice low. Boss didn't flinch. "No," he said. I'm pointing at it. For a heartbeat, the whole street hung between two futures. And from inside the jail, a voice suddenly broke loose, hoarse, terrified, real. They're going to take us out the back. The crowd surged like a startled animal. People shouted. Someone pushed forward. A rock sailed through the air and bounced off wood with a dull thud. Rusk flinched hard. Creed's men stepped into a line, rifles coming up, their faces set like they'd rehearsed this part. Above it all, the bell rang again, wild now, frantic, as if somebody had grabbed the rope and decided panic was the fastest way to control a town. Charlie leaned close to Boss, speaking through clenched teeth. This is it. He's lighting the fuse. Boss didn't look away from Creed. His voice stayed low, almost gentle. Then we put it out. And as Creed's men began to raise their rifles toward the crowd, and the town's fear finally started choosing sides, Boss's hand lowered toward his holster, not in anger, not in show, but in decision.
The first shot didn't come from Boss. It came from Creed's line. Some nervous man with a rifle and too much courage borrowed from the crowd behind him. One twitch of a finger, one bright spit of fire, and a townsman near the front spun like he'd been yanked by an invisible rope. He hit the mud hard, and for half a heartbeat the whole street went silent, stunned that the story had turned real. Then Dry Fork exploded. People screamed and scattered, boots slapped mud, a horse snapped at its reins and reared against the hitching rail. Glass shattered somewhere, one of those sharp, clean sounds that feels wrong in a place built of rough wood and dirt. The bell tower loomed overhead like a witness that refused to blink. Boss moved without haste, and that was the strangest part. He didn't rush like a man chasing anger. He moved like a man stepping into work. His hand went to his revolver, and 2 shots cracked through the air, flat, controlled. One of Creed's men folded backward over the porch rail. Another crumpled into the street as if his legs had been taken away. The sound didn't echo much. Mud and wood swallowed it fast. Charlie fired from near the jailhouse corner, using the building like it was built for this exact purpose. He'd shoot, shift, shoot again, never staying in one place long enough for a bullet to remember him. It wasn't flashy. It was the kind of movement learned the hard way, the kind that doesn't look heroic up close. It looks practiced. The crowd did what crowds do when the first body drops. It broke apart into smaller, frightened pieces. Some people ran for alleys, some slammed themselves behind barrels and troughs. A few froze in the open, not knowing which direction safety lived in. And then, the rain started. Not a polite drizzle, a sudden heavy sheet that fell like the sky had finally made up its mind. Dust turned to paste, streets became slick, dark rivers. The gun smoke didn't rise clean anymore. It tangled with mist and rain and hung low, making everything feel closer and worse. Creed's men fired from the porch and the windows of his stock office. Bullets tore splinters out of the unfinished church boards. The schoolhouse window shook. The bell tower rope swung wildly, not from ringing now, but from wind and panic, like the tower itself couldn't decide whether it wanted to call people together or warn them away. Iker, still young, still trying to learn what fear sounded like in English, ducked behind a trough and tried to find Boss through the rain. He could see shapes moving, coats darkening, hats slick, bodies shrinking behind whatever cover they could find. He saw Della Hart pull an older woman down behind a barrel and cover her like a shield. Della didn't look like she was praying. She looked like she was waiting. Boss crossed open ground through the rain, stepping through the chaos as if it was just another stretch of bad country. A rifle shot slapped mud near his boots, spraying water and dirt. Boss didn't flinch. He didn't even speed up. Charlie saw it and shouted something, maybe a warning, maybe a curse, but the rain ate the words. Near the porch posts, Sheriff Rusk crouched with his star bright on his chest like a bad joke. He looked sick, shaking, as if his body had decided to betray him right when it was time to choose. And then Iker saw Rusk raise his revolver towards Boss's back. For a second, it felt like the whole fight narrowed to that one trembling hand. Boss turned his head slightly, not a full turn, not a dramatic stare, just enough. That small motion stopped Rusk cold. The sheriff rose with the gun half raised, rain running off his hat brim, his mouth open like he'd forgotten what he meant to do. Boss didn't shoot him, he didn't even point a gun at him. He only spoke, voice carrying through the rain like it had weight. Make a choice, Boss said, or get out of the way of men who have. Rusk lowered the revolver slowly, not redeemed, just outmatched. On the porch, Creed watched his line start to bend. For the first time, something ugly showed through his polish. It wasn't fear exactly, it was offense, like the world had broken a rule he thought he'd written. Charlie kept advancing, step by step. He moved between doorways and barrels, using angles and timing the way other men use prayer. He reloaded once, hands steady even with rainwater running down his wrists. When he reached the porch steps, one of Creed's men swung a rifle butt at him. Charlie ducked, slammed his shoulder in, and fired at close range. The man dropped, and the porch boards trembled on the sudden weight. Boss kicked in the jailhouse door and walked straight through the dim interior, past chained deputies who groaned and reached like broken tools. Boss didn't stop. He wasn't there to rescue the law. He was there to remove Creed's. Outside, a man sprinted towards the bell tower, reaching for the rope like it could summon help. Boss saw him, raised his revolver, and fired once. The runner dropped at the base of the tower, face first into mud. The rope swung a moment, then settled. The bell did not ring again. And in that sudden absence, the gunfight changed. Without the
the bell to give it a rhythm, it felt less like a ritual and more like what it was. Men killing men in the rain because nobody could bear to back down. Boss stepped onto Creed's porch. Rain slanted between them like a curtain. Creed raised his own revolver with elegant steadiness, gloves dark with water, posture still preacher clean. "You're ruining my town," Creed said, as if the town were furniture. Boss's voice was quieter than the rain. "It was never yours." Creed fired first. Boss moved sideways in one smooth step, coat flaring with real weight and inertia. The bullet bit into porch wood behind him, splinters snapping loose. Boss fired back once, calm as a man closing a door. Creed staggered. The shot caught him high in the shoulder. His revolver clattered on the wet boards, spinning once before the rain pinned it down. Creed dropped to one knee, blood mixing with wire on his white shirt. For a moment, everything around them felt slower. Shouts muffled, boots slipping, smoke and rain blending into one gray breath. Boss stood over Creed with his revolver aimed. Then he lowered it. Not mercy, not forgiveness, just refusal. Refusal to make Creed's death the center of his own life. Charlie stepped up beside Boss, breathing hard, rain plastering his hair against his face. "You done?" Charlie asked, like he was asking about a fence line. Boss didn't look away from the street. Not yet. That's when Creed smiled. It was thin, spiteful, almost pleased. "You think you've won," Creed rasped, voice rough with pain and rain. "But my riders, they have your flock." The words landed hard, colder than the storm. Boss's expression tightened, Charlie's jaw clenched. Down in the street, townsfolk began to push Creed's remaining men back with tools and desperate courage, hammers, posts, anything they could grip. Dry Fork was changing in real time, not because it had suddenly become brave, but because it had finally become tired of being afraid. Boss looked out into the rain-washed street as if measuring distance, time, and blood. Then he turned away from Creed and stepped off the porch, holstering his revolver with a controlled motion. Mud grabbed his boots. He didn't stumble. Charlie followed immediately, giving one tight nod, as if the argument about what came next had already been settled somewhere between them long ago. Behind them, the bell tower stood silent in the rain haze. The town, finally awake, began to bind wounds and gather itself into something sturdier than panic. And Boss and Charlie moved toward their horses at the edge of town, not with triumph, not with speeches, only with the grim urgency of men who knew the fight wasn't finished. Because out beyond Dry Fork, somewhere in the dark wet range, lanterns were still burning. And sheep, soft, helpless things, were waiting to learn what kind of men had found them.
They rode out of Dry Fork under a sky that still couldn't decide whether it was finished being angry. Rain kept coming in hard sheets, turning the street into a shallow river that tugged at boot soles and horse hooves. Behind them, the town's lanterns blurred into watery smears, and the bell tower stood dark and silent, like it had said all it meant to say. Della Hart watched them go from the edge of a porch, rain darkening her sleeves. She didn't call out. She didn't wave. She just stood there with a steady face, the way people stand when they've learned goodbyes are often temporary out here. Boss rode at the front, shoulders squared beneath a coat that was heavy with water. Charlie kept pace beside him, scanning the edges of the street as if trouble might try one last cheap shot before they cleared town. And Iker, still young, still new to the way fear could be organized, rode with them too. No one had told him to come. No one had promised him safety. But the rain, the gunfire, and Creed's parting words had made one thing clear. A boy alone on the range was just another thing men could use. Charlie reached into his pocket without looking and dropped a small handful of cartridges into Iker's palm. The gesture was rough, almost careless, but it carried its own kind of acceptance. Iker closed his fingers around the wet brass, like it might keep his ribs from cracking open. They left the last buildings behind and pushed into open country. The storm thinned into cold mist, and the land opened wide again, sage flats rolling into distant ridges, all of it slick and shining under a bruised sky. Hooves slipped now and then in wet clay, then caught again. The horses moved with the stubborn steadiness of animals that had learned the shape of bad weather. No one talked much. There wasn't anything to say that would make the distance shorter. As they climbed a long rise, Boss slowed and looked out ahead. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes tightened, like a man spotting smoke before he sees the fire. Down in the valley, lanterns moved. Not a few, many. They bobbed and drifted in loose patterns, the way fireflies drift, except these lights had men attached to them, riders. 15, maybe 20, enough to make the skin between your shoulders feel exposed. And in the low pocket of land below, the flock was bunched tight, driven into a place where sheep couldn't scatter. Wet wool clung together, pale bodies pressed so close they looked like a single breathing thing. The men around them weren't just watching. They were arranging, containing, like stacking kindling. Iker's stomach went cold. He could smell smoke even from that distance, or maybe he only imagined it because his mind couldn't accept what his eyes were seeing. Charlie counted under his breath, eyes narrowing. 15, maybe 20. Harlan appeared from the far side of the ridge a few minutes later, soaked and shaken. He looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the valley on his shoulders. "They drove them in at night," Harlan whispered. "I couldn't get close. They'd have shot me." Boss didn't blame him. He didn't blame anyone. He just studied the valley like it was a map drawn in mud. For a moment, Charlie said the thing most men would say first, quietly, almost kindly. "We could leave. Get out. Live." Boss didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was calm. Too calm for the picture below. "If we leave," Boss said, "they'll do this to the next flock, next camp, next boy who can't speak the right language." Charlie's jaw clenched.
Something old moved behind his eyes, an agreement he didn't like, but couldn't deny. Boss's plan came out low and simple, the way a man talks when he's already decided. Harlan and Iker would circle left, staying high, taking out lanterns and torches. Charlie would go right and cut off retreat. Boss would go straight down. Iker stared at him, straight down. Boss didn't look at him like he was foolish. He looked at him like he was young. They won't expect it, Boss said. Charlie muttered, almost like a prayer he didn't believe in. They never do. They moved. Rain had softened everything. Hoofbeats were muffled. Rocks were slick. The air smelled of wet sage and smoke that hadn't happened yet. Boss descended the slope alone, upright, unhurried, walking into the valley like the ground belonged to him for those few minutes. One rider spotted movement and raised a rifle. Boss fired once. The man dropped without ceremony, lantern smashing in mud, flame hissing out under rain like a lie being corrected. That one shot broke the valley open. Men shouted, horses snorted and shifted. Lantern light swung wildly, making faces flicker in and out of shadow. Sheep pressed tighter, bleeding like small panicked hearts. From the ridge, Harlan fired first. Clean shots, aimed not at bodies, but at light. Lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed whole patches of the valley. Iker followed, clumsy at first, then steadier, aiming for the glow, not the men. Every lantern that went out changed the fight, not because it killed someone, but because it stole confidence. Men felt braver when they could see each other. On the right ridge, Charlie fired in short, deliberate bursts. Riders trying to break out towards higher ground found that direction suddenly expensive. One man tried to turn uphill and spun out of his saddle, sliding in wet dirt. Charlie didn't cheer. He just kept cutting the valley's exits down to fewer and fewer options. Boss moved through the valley itself like a shadow that refused to be startled. A rider swung a rifle butt at him. Boss stepped aside, grabbed the barrel, shoved hard, and the rider stumbled. Boss fired once, close, and kept walking. Another man rushed with a torch raised like he meant to set the flock on fire anyway, rain be damned. Boss shot the torch out of his hand. The flame spun into mud and died. Then Boss kicked the man in the chest, knocking him down like he was clearing brush. Charlie's voice cut across the valley from the right, half angry and half amazed. Boss, you trying to scare him to death? Boss didn't answer. He didn't waste breath on performance. He was too busy doing the work. Iker watched from the ridge, heart pounding, and realized something that didn't fit the stories he'd heard in saloons. Boss wasn't reckless. He wasn't hungry for violence. He was simply inevitable. Down in the pocket, the sheep shivered and trembled, eyes reflecting the last lanterns like tiny moons. The men around them began to break. They hadn't expected coordination. They hadn't expected a shepherd to walk straight into their trap. A rider on the far side did something desperate. He grabbed a bell, small, iron, and rang it once as if sound alone could summon courage back into the world. That bell again. Boss turned his head toward it. The bellman fired twice, panic in his shoulders. One shot went wide. One tore through Boss's coat, ripping cloth. Boss didn't even change pace. He raised his revolver and fired once. The bellman's arm jerked. The bell fell into the mud with a dull, final thud, half submerged, rainwater pooling around it. The signal was gone. The sound was gone. And suddenly the valley felt quieter, as if the land itself had been waiting for that bell to shut up. The remaining riders fled. Horses scrambled up slick slopes, slipping, finding traction, slipping again. Charlie fired one last shot, not to kill, just to hurry them. Then the darkness swallowed them. Silence spread slowly, not peace, just the absence of shouting. Boss stood among the sheep, rain dripping from his hat brim, coat torn. Charlie walked up beside him, reloading out of habit, breathing hard, eyes still scanning as if trouble might decide to turn around. You get hit? Charlie asked. Boss touched the tear in his coat. Just cloth, he said. Charlie exhaled, a sound that almost carried relief. Cloth cost money, he muttered. Boss's mouth twitched, barely a smile, like a match struck and immediately protected from the wind. I'll put it on Creed's tab, he said. Dawn began to creep in then, pale and slow. Rain eased in the mist. Smoke thinned. The flock was still alive, shaken, crowded, stinking of fear, but alive. Up on the ridge, Iker stared down at the two men in the valley, and the awe in his chest wasn't admiration the way stories sell it. It was something heavier. He understood that courage wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just a man standing where another man said he couldn't stand, and not moving. And as the sky lightened over wet sage and black rocks, Boss and Charlie didn't look triumphant. They looked present, like men who had finished one page of trouble, and already felt the next one turn.
Dry Fork never became one of those towns people brag about in saloons. It didn't end up in dime novels the way Tombstone did, or Dodge City, or any place with a name that sounded like a gunshot. It was just a scratch of buildings on a stretch of stubborn land, a place where the mud dried, then got wet again, and men tried to pretend they weren't afraid of their own neighbors. But something changed there all the same. After the rain stopped and the last of the smoke thinned out, the town moved the way a body moves after a hard fever, slow, sore, and careful. Folks patched up the wounded with torn cloth and boiled water. They swept broken glass out of doorways. They gathered dropped hats and empty shells, like they were embarrassed to leave evidence of what they'd allowed. Della Hart kept her boarding house open through it all. She fed whoever came through, drifters, freight men, ranch hands who suddenly spoke a little softer than they used to. Some of them stayed long enough to learn what a town looked like when it stopped flinching every time one man cleared his throat. Some of them left before that lesson had a chance to take.
Creed didn't last long after that day on the porch. 2 days later, he died in a back room that smelled of lamp oil and sweat, his wound gone bad the way wounds do when pride keeps a man from admitting he's just flesh. He'd raved, they said, about land, about order, about what belonged to him, like a deed could follow a man into the dark and keep him warm. No one made a grand display of his passing. There was no anthem, no speech, just a coffin that didn't fit the legend he'd built for himself, carried out in early light when the street was quiet enough to hear boots and mud. Sheriff Rusk disappeared not long after. One day he was there, star shining too bright on a chest that never earned it. The next day he was gone. Folks said he rode out before dawn like a man escaping his own reflection. They found his star later, nailed to the jailhouse door. Not polished, not ceremonious, just pinned there like an apology nobody asked for. The kind of apology that doesn't fix anything, but at least admits what happened. The bell tower still stood above Dry Fork, too tall for the town's pride and too heavy with memory. People argued about that bell the way people argue about scars, whether you should hide them or live with them, or cut them off and hope the skin grows clean. In the end, they left the bell where it was, but they took the rope down for a while, coiled it and stored it away, like the town needed time to forget what that sound had been used for, like silence could be a kind of medicine. Out on the range, Boss and Charlie didn't celebrate. They didn't throw their hats in the air. They just did what they always did, kept moving. Weeks later, they delivered what remained of the flock to the railhead. The sheep came in thinner than they'd started, their wool singed in places, their eyes still skittish from too many nights of lantern light and shouting. Dead sheep don't weigh much, and burned wool doesn't sell for the kind of money that makes a man feel safe. The payment was light. The rail agent counted it out like it was a favor. Boss accepted it without a word. No complaint, no bargaining. Just a quiet closing of fingers around coins that didn't match the cost of what had been lost. Charlie watched the money light in Boss's palm and let out a tired little breath that might have been laughter if it hadn't sounded so worn down. They bought what they needed anyway. Flour, coffee, canvas, cartridges, the plain things that keep a man alive on the trail. Boss replaced his torn coat with a second-hand one that didn't fit him right, too stiff in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves, like it belonged to a banker who'd made a mistake and ended up west. Charlie teased him for days. "That coat makes you look respectable," he said, like respectable was an insult. Boss didn't rise to it much. He glanced down at the sleeves and said, "Dry as always. Then maybe folks will stop shooting at me." Charlie snorted. "Folks shoot bankers too," he answered, just slower. And for a moment, just a moment, it sounded almost like life could be ordinary again. Not easy, not clean, just ordinary in the way a man might call quiet breathing a luxury. Their last night near Dry Fork, they camped on a ridge above town. From up there, the buildings looked small and harmless, and the lanterns in the windows flickered like candles trying not to go out. The bell tower was still visible, a dark shape against the sky, but without the rope it looked less like a command and more like a relic, something that had done its damage and now had to live with itself. Charlie sat by the fire cleaning his revolver, hands moving from habit more than need. Boss drank coffee so black it looked like a hole in a tin cup. The sheep settled below them, a pale ripple in the grass. Charlie looked across the fire at Boss and finally said what had been circling behind his eyes for a long time. "You ever think about stopping?" Boss stared into the flames. He didn't answer fast. When he did, it was simple. "Sometimes." Charlie nodded like that was enough honesty for one night. "I think about it too," Charlie admitted. Then, with the smallest edge of humor, he added, "But I don't know what I'd do if I wasn't walking into trouble." Boss glanced at him. "You could learn to play cards." Charlie laughed once, short and dry. "I'd get shot," he said. "Cheating comes too natural." Boss's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost. They didn't give each other speeches. They didn't talk about forgiveness or justice or any other word that sounds nice in a church and useless in a street full of mud. They just watched the fire and listened to the wind and let the night be what it was. In the morning they moved again. Boss and Charlie rode with the flock flowing behind them like a pale river, leaving Dry Fork to shrink into distance. The town became a line, then a dot, then nothing at all. The bell tower disappeared.